Hello everyone, my name is Christian Jachnovic. I work as EATG training coordinator, and I would like to welcome you to our today's webinar on the presentation of the research that has been undertaken by Josef Rapa on the participation of women living with HIV in HIV clinical trials. As you know, this research was one of the pillars of the Metrodora project. And the research report is now in its final stage. It's being finalized and hopefully published soon. And I have asked Mark to just to present a bit on his methodology on the results of his research during today's webinar. And thank you very much, Mark, to be with us today and to do this presentation. It's very appreciated. This webinar will be recorded and we will publish and disseminate the recording soon. So within the next half an hour, Mark will present, give his presentation, and then we will have time to answer some questions. If you have questions, please write them in the question box, so you can see in your in the panel, there is a window called questions. So you will write them and I will see it, and then I will moderate the Q&A and just read your questions to Mark. All right, enough from my side. Mark, the stage is yours.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you, Christian, for that introduction. So practically, if you could share the screen, or maybe it's already being shared.
Is it not shared now?
I can't see it.
1 second. So now you see it, right?
Technology, yes, I do. Sorry, technology is not really my forte. So, to start off, basically this project, we've been working on it since the end of October and November. And practically what it aims to, if we can go to the second slide, Christian, here. So what the study aims to do is to identify the number of women participants in HIV clinical trials. It includes both observational and clinical trials. It's important to mention that this report focuses on 4 countries. It focuses on the United Kingdom, on France, Spain, and Russia, and on trials which been held between 2005 and 2015. The reason why we chose this period, I will explain a few slides later on today. It also seeks to identify the barriers. These barriers were identified from a literature review which I conducted over the last couple of weeks, over the last couple of months. Barriers which affect the inclusion of women, first of all, the recruitment, the inclusion, and the retention of women in clinical trials. And ultimately, as with any other study, what it seeks to do is to make recommendations to the relevant stakeholders to make changes, the necessary changes, which would see women included more in clinical trials. Next slide, Christian, please. So why did we feel the need for such a study? In the last year or so, EATG has been focusing on working on women and the importance of putting women at the forefront and making sure, ascertain that the needs of women living with HIV are being met. And this is simply because of it falls within 2 main reasons. You have the biological differences between men and women. So this implies that the way the drugs work in women and in men is different. This is what we refer to as the pharmacokinetics of the drugs. So biologically, men and women are different. So the drugs which we have might not work the same way in men and in women. They might not have the same result, and they might not have the same side effects. Any adverse events or adverse effects on men might not be the same on women. There are also social differences. in different countries in particular, where women might not be given the importance or the platform which they need, and they might also feel that they need the medication, that they cannot rather take medication as freely as men can. For example, there might be issues of domestic violence. Most of us would remember that people living with HIV had to take up to 3 or 4 drugs a day. Now it's just 1 pill a day. But if you see a person taking more than 1 pill a day or having adverse effects, that might lead to some sort of discrimination, possibly, or even violence. Next slide. So the background, which we now we've heard over and over again. So globally, we have 36.7 million adults who are living with HIV. 50% and over 50% are women, and they're over the age of 15. In 2016, this is the latest data which we have so far, 43% of the average 4,500 daily new infections reported were amongst women. Now, this data is up to 2016. We know that since then we have pre-exposure prophylaxis, which might change numbers, as it already is seen to be changing numbers. But this study does not deal with pre-exposure prophylaxis. Not that it's not important, it's just it doesn't fall within the what was requested in the proposal. Next slide, Christian, please. So why were women, or why are women still not being proportionally represented in clinical trials? We have, or rather I could see, 2 possible explanations. One of them is regulatory. In the 1960s, we had what we now refer to as the thalidomide scandal. Thalidomide was a drug which was prescribed to combat morning sickness in pregnancy. The problem with this drug is that it led to the death of 80,000 babies, and it led to deformities of another 20,000. This drug was marketed only in Europe. The US had flagged when the company had sought to get approval, a market approval in the US, the person dealing with the market authorization did not approve because of concerns she had with the drug. And in fact, it was not approved. And ironically or funnily enough, when the thalidomide scandal erupted in Europe, the USA, through the FDA, sought to enact legislation, enact safety measures, which would protect women from medication which would affect their health in an adverse way or affect the way of the embryo or fetus they might be carrying. The problem is that these safety measures were excluded women completely from phase 1 and phase 2 trials between the period of 1979 and 1993. So in that period of time, women were completely barred from phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trials, and missed the opportunity to actually know how drugs worked in phase 1 and phase 2 in that period of time in women. But after 1993 and to date, it was recognized that women have a role to play in clinical research, that women are as important as men in society, and that their health needs cannot be ignored. We have to remember here that it was only in the 1920s that women got the right to vote. So whilst it doesn't justify such a stance, we have to appreciate the great strides that women have achieved through their hard work and the hard work of allies into pushing forward for greater inclusion and equality in all stratas of society. So even up to date, on the FDA, what it now does is that for any trials which are funded by the state, there has to be a minimum percentage of women included in those particular trials. The second important background information is the issue of protectionism, or it's mostly familiarly called paternalism, where women are seen to be only as the child bearers or as the caregivers in a particular society, completely disregarding the fact that women have potential and have capacity to make an informed decision, and that women do not have a voice in society. This has been in recent years changing and will hopefully keep on changing for the better. Next slide, please. So what have we done in this report? So the methodology which we used, as already explained, dealt with 4 countries: the UK, France, Spain, and Russia, and between a selected 10-year period. We chose this particular 10-year period because we saw that it is the most recent, and it gives us information. It gives us information on the most recent drugs which we have available on the market. It also allows for 2 years for publication of results. For example, trials which would have been completed by the end of 2015, but results might not have been given back to clinicaltrials.gov, or a paper not published as yet. So we allowed for that 2-year period for the publication of results. So these trials were identified through the clinicaltrials.gov portal, and they had to be of therapeutic nature in the selected countries, and the participation had to be of both female and male participants above the age of 18. This is fairly obvious because we needed to have the percentages of men and women which were included in the trial. I have to point out here that the trials which I went into, only dealt with cisgender women. This does not mean that the trans community is not important, not our intention at all, but we do know that the needs of the trans community are different, and it would not have been fair, or rather we wouldn't have been able to give a fair representation of the trials being held if we included female, male, and trans participants, because we know that the needs are different. The next slide, please. So we started off with a total number of 560 trials. Those are the number of trials which fit the criteria which I've just mentioned in the previous slide. Now, from that number, we had to filter according to the countries. So most of the 560 trials were held in multiple countries. As we know, some trials can be held exclusively in one country, or they can be held in multiple countries. Now, since the proposal was only for national countries, we had to filter out, exclude those trials which were held in more than one country. And secondly, after that exclusion criteria, we had the second exclusion criteria, where results were not available on clinicaltrials.gov portal. Now, some of the trials where results were not available on the portal, we went a step ahead. We went a step further, and we tried to find a published paper in a peer-reviewed journal which gives information on a particular trial. In some cases, this was a successful search, which means that we found papers that were related to the trial, which were about the trial. In some cases, unfortunately, papers were not published or could not be tracked down on PubMed. The next slide, please. So out of that total of 560 trials, the total number of trials held exclusively in each identified countries were those which you could see on your screens right now. So we had 42 trials in the UK, 60 in France, in Spain we had 95 trials, and in Russia we had 3. Now, for those trials, then results were only available either through the clinicaltrials.gov portal or through an identified paper in a peer-reviewed journal. We only had 23 for the UK, 44 for France, 60 for Spain, and 3 for Russia. Yes, so it's a total of 200. It's still a very much a low amount of trials when compared to the original 590. But even though small, it gives us an indication of what's actually happening in these countries. Next slide, please. Sorry. So this is how we decided to present the results. So what we've got here is the range of participation of women living with HIV in the set period in those particular countries. Because the number of trials in Russia was very small, we only identified 3 trials which satisfied our criteria. It was thought best to exclude Russia from the analysis. So what we have here is that for the UK, the average percentage, the range was from 0 to 60.5%. In Spain, we had from 0 to 68.1%, and in France from 0 to 58.3%. So one might say, okay, that is a very high number. The 60.5% is a high number, the 68.1% is a high number. Nonetheless, once you analyze the trials which we identified, one notices that it is for observational trials that the number of women participants is actually quite high. In fact, if we are to pick on France, for example, so in France we have an estimate of 58.3%, as you can see on your screens. But that 58.3% comes from observational trials. The maximum amount of women recruited in interventional studies is only reaches a maximum of 36.5%. A similar story is reported for the United Kingdom. In the United Kingdom, in interventional trials, the maximum amount of women reported in a particular trial was only that of 36.4%. The 60.5% which you see on your screens comes actually from observational studies. And the same pattern was identified for Spain. Next slide, please. So, once we created the average percentages of women, what we've come up is with this sort of concluding average that for France there was a 32% recruitment of women, 41% for the United Kingdom, and 27% for Spain. As I mentioned before, this report includes both observational and both interventional trials. So the data has to be obviously interpreted within the methodology of the report and cannot just be lifted and interpreted in any other way, because it wouldn't reflect the chart as is. Next slide, please. So after we did that step of identifying the actual numbers, and we know that we have confirmed when we review other papers that what our study shows that there's exactly the same information as other reports or studies have identified, that women are still, to this very date, even though there were huge campaigns in the past and huge campaigns in the present, they are still underrepresented in trials. What does this mean? This means that we have a missed opportunity. We know that if a person is taking his or her medication, then obviously there is a higher chance of them reaching an undetectable level, which means that they cannot transmit the virus to someone else. So if what's happening that women are experiencing more adverse events or adverse effects by taking a particular medication, and these adverse effects are leading them to stop taking medication, then we are possibly and potentially affecting that they reach the undetectable level. So that's why one of the main reasons why it is important that we have women included in clinical trials. So the drugs which we have are drugs which are safe, not only safe for them, but which present the least adverse effects, so they can reach an undetectable level. The second unmet need is that women experience hormonal differences. They take the hormonal contraception pill, and there is some medication which might interfere with the contraceptive pill. And it is very important that we know which drugs do so, and if these drugs do so, in what dosage, because it could be very much the case where a drug could be prescribed to women, but not at the dosage that it is being marketed for. And we also have the issue of hormones, as I mentioned before, that women go through changes in life, go through more changes in life than men. So we might have to track women, especially during menopause range, and ascertain that the treatment regime which they are taking that is not affecting their body adversely. The next slide, please. So, apologies. The identified barriers are very much similar to other fields of research. In fact, what I found out from the literature review is that the participation of women is actually low across the board. We have a very low participation of women in cardiovascular diseases, in lung cancer, for example, or even depression and Alzheimer's disease. So what the barriers which I'm going to mention in this presentation are also barriers which other women face when being recruited in other trials which are not necessarily HIV clinical trials. That's the first aspect which we need to keep in mind when we are actually, as advocates, to remember, so we can, when we are joining other women activist group who are working for the same for the same message, that the barriers which we have in one setting are the same as in another setting, and what works to break those barriers in one setting could just as well also work to break the barriers in HIV research. Earlier on, I hinted at protectionist perspectives. This was linked to the thalidomide scandal. As already mentioned, that paternalism sort of still conquers, still encapsulates the research field. If, for example, the trial which you have an interest in, it is up to your clinician to refer you to that trial. If the clinician which you have might hold a very hard paternalistic views, then they might not push you forward, or they might not even tell you about a particular trial. This is something which we need to work on with clinicians and relevant stakeholders. Pregnancy, this is more of an ethical and cost issues. When it comes to ethics, what we have is that most trials, the ones I have found at least, all of them excluded pregnant women. This goes back to not only thalidomide scandal, but way before, when we have the issue of what the embryo is, what the fetus is, and whether that fetus and embryo has any rights, any legal rights. So by excluding pregnant women from trials, we are then also excluding a huge sector of the society. And then what we are doing is we are prescribing drugs which would not have necessarily been tested on pregnant women to pregnant women. So there is some sort of a dilemma there of what we are going to do. This would require, in my opinion at least, that there is a discussion again on the ethics of having pregnant women in clinical trials, and also emphasize the importance of pregnant women in clinical trials. The fourth one is that in 1991, which you can read there, women don't get AIDS, they just die from it. That was a headline of an ACT UP advertisement featured in the New York Times in the 1991 International AIDS Conference. In a gist, what this means is that earlier on, all HIV campaigns surrounded gay men, were revolving around gay men, disregarding or maybe not giving that much importance to women. So women were not being reached out, women were not being sought to get tested. So women were marginalized and they were just dying of AIDS, when this could have been easily be prevented if the right campaigning was actually put into place to include all those who were suffering from HIV and AIDS. The fifth one there is the increased costs and stroke demands by female patients. Possibly that word demands there is a bit strong. I'm going to explain in a bit what I mean. The increased costs is because earlier on I mentioned that that women might be the caregivers at home. They might be the people who are in charge of the house, of the children, etc., etc. So they have increased demands. There might be the need for childcare. The increase of the issue of childcare was highlighted, in fact, in the GRACE study. The GRACE study, which managed to include a huge number, the highest number of women to date in a clinical trial, and that was, if I'm not mistaken, it was 67% of the participants in the GRACE study were women. There were increased costs of childcare, and also you need to be a bit more practical, simply because the needs of men and women are different, which is very much a fair and maybe a simplistic statement to make, but there shouldn't be a reason, there shouldn't be any argument against meeting those needs, because ultimately what we're here trying to achieve is trying to give people, both women and men, the right to health at its very best. Last but not least is a very strange barrier. When you have a clinical trial, when in the past you would have had a clinical trial rather, which would have studied a particular drug in a particular cohort of people, with a majority of that cohort being men, it's much easier to have a similar cohort nowadays with a similar number of people of the same sex. So if you're going to change, if you already have the work half done, let's say in the past, you might want to keep that to save on the costs of the trial which you are currently pursuing. Next slide, please. So another barrier which was seen is the reporting of data that no data was fueled back to the clinicaltrials.gov portal, which then affected the way we could interpret the result. Furthermore, on the portal, one would find the number on the clinical trials portal and also in the published papers. What you would have is the number of women who were included in the analysis. You might not have the actual number of people who were approached from the trial, but they were actually filtered out because of exclusion criteria or another reason. So it's maybe important to have also that information so we can know why women are possibly not being included after being approached in the clinical approach to be included. That might help us activists to provide more help and more information when such information is needed. There is also the lack of summaries, which is going to be remedied to be fair, by new legislation. The FDA included Amendment 2007, which pursues to make all summaries, to have lay summaries of the trial which was conducted, which means that any individual who has interest in a trial or just merely an interest in a particular field of medicine could just go in and find a particular trial and read of what's going on in the world of science. And the new EU regulation, which is meant to come in force in the next months, also seeks to also make results available and also seeks to make lay summaries available for anyone who wants to read them. This would facilitate the experience of this was actually encourage more people to participate, because they would feel, as was identified in the GRACE study, they would feel that they're contributing to the world of science and that they're also contributing to healthcare at large. The next slide, please. So I'm close to here to my last slides, in fact. So the conclusions which we have drawn from the study is that the number of women in clinical trials is still disproportionate to that of men. We need to find ways how to change those figures and to give women the best possible healthcare treatment regime which they deserve. The second point, which I also mentioned, is that there's a higher incidence of women participating in observational rather than interventional trials. For some people, this is very obvious, because in observational trials, you might not have the need of certain uptake of certain medication. An observational trial might just be a review of hospital files. So obviously, the participation of women might be higher, whilst in clinical trials there is more that is going on and requires more of the participant. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, there's lack of information available, lack of results being published, and lack of information between the recruited and actually enrolled in the clinical in the trial. Next slide. So what do we recommend? What is the purpose of the Metrodora project, and what would we like to see changing? Is that women's needs can no longer be ignored. There are a number of campaigns out there going on, which Shima Tariq has also mentioned in her webinar a couple of weeks ago. The needs of women can no longer be ignored, and it actually goes against human rights, the right to health, that we ignore women's health. The second point is that hard paternalism and over protectionism is no longer a tenable position. We need to engage in a conversation. We need to engage in a conversation with the clinicians, with people who are living with HIV, and ascertain that the conversation that is taking place between clinicians and people living with HIV is a holistic one. This has been something which I've been hearing in the conferences which I have attended. It's really something which I've had in the EX conference last October or November, that doctors have to ask and assess what the patients want, what is the lifestyle of that patient, and that the medication has to reflect and match the patient. The same has to go for clinical trials. Clinical trials have to be designed in a way that women feel involved, that their needs are being met, and that their voice is being heard. Thirdly, that there are needs for legislative changes in the US. As I mentioned, they have quotas where research is being funded by the government of how many women should be included in a particular trial. Maybe we could work for something similar to reach a quota, if you must, of women in clinical trials. Also, I suggest and recommend further research on additional barriers. These additional barriers, which are so far are being studied, as we are aware from Shima's presentation last week, but there are additional barriers which constantly arise, and these additional barriers which we need to engage in a conversation with women about, and we have to learn hands-on how we as advocates in particular, how we as EATG can find ways to remedy these flaws and these gaps in research, and find ways how to provide women with the best health needs as possible. Thank you from my end. That's practically it. In my next slide, I have some acknowledgements. The steering committee, Christy Antoniadi, Maria Duterte, Ian Hodgson, Damien Kelly, and Christian. Thank you very much for the support which you have given me in this journey, and I sincerely hope that you've enjoyed this webinar and has given you more information on what's actually happening out there on women in HIV clinical trials. If you've got any questions, just fire away.
Thank you very much, Mark, for this presentation of your research and the results. Dear participants, you can put your question in writing. You have a question box where you can write down the question, and then I will read them out loud to Mark. While everyone is typing, Mark, I have one question. Is during your research, did you whether some methodological limitations, or are there some ideas where you think it would be good to look further into some sort of subjects, maybe to look more into data again? So what kind of follow-up research would be needed from your perspective?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Christian. I think that the needs of women and the practical barriers might change according to the age group which you are targeting. For example, if you're trying to do a research with women in their, say, 40s and 50s, and the research with women in their 20s and 30s, you might have different barriers there, which might attract different discussions and different results. So possibly maybe a research on the different barriers according to the age groups. We might feel that women who are younger, maybe they are more likely to participate, and older women are not. And why is there such a difference? And what can we do there to change it? But I think it would be interesting to see if, other than just the women at large, maybe a study on the age groups might give us maybe a different idea of what's actually happening out there.
Thank you very much. I'm looking at the question window. So there's one question from Joe. how receptive are pharma to including more women as a basic quality standard in future research? Should we be lobbying them or lobbying researchers, or both?
So it's a very good question. Thank you for that. In a couple of weeks' time, we will be presenting this report to a group of stakeholders, which includes both pharma companies and researchers. Who to approach? I think, in my opinion at least, I think if you approach both all the stakeholders, but in different ways, you might get a better result. It might be easier to approach researchers, maybe because of the discussions which might be held, and maybe there's with pharma companies it might be a bit more difficult to reach. But I do believe that both researchers and pharma companies have a role to play, and there are some companies which are actively working on women. Some pharma companies are working exclusively on women-only trials, for example. And the GRACE study, for example, which did a study only on women in the US, showed that this is possible, that the barriers which the pharma companies or researchers meet can be solved with some will from both ends. So the lobbying has to be done, I think, first primarily by getting all the activists together. I cannot stress enough the importance of having activists working together, different organizations working together with the same aim, and working together and push for a change together. I think the push for change can be done. The change can be done by both pharma companies and by researchers as well.
So another question, could you spell out the study name GRACE study so I can look it up?
Yes.
An article on the GRACE study is also in the resources, the Metrodora resource website. But yeah, Mark, go ahead.
Yes, the GRACE study, if I'm not mistaken, is actually included in the Metrodora reading list. The GRACE study is actually, the name is Gender, Race and Clinical Experience. Okay, so this study began in 2006. It was done in the US, and it studied the drug. I can't remember off the top of my head now. Sorry, it studied darunavir. It studied darunavir and how it works in women. It's a very interesting study. It gives us a clear picture of the barriers and how these can be solved. If you go on Google or any other browser which you like, you'll find a lot of information. There's a lot of presentations actually on the GRACE study and how the GRACE study in itself already changed the way research is being done. So it's GRACE, GRACE, and it stands for Gender, Race and Clinical Experience.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. I don't see any other questions. So thank you very much, dear participants, for being with us. Thank you, Mark, for your work and for preparing this webinar. I wish you all a very good day.
Thank you very much.